I'm pleased to invite the Honourable Nick Greiner, in whose government John served and whom he followed as Premier, to offer some words of remembrance.
John Joseph Fahey, known up the road in Parliament House as Have a Chat. Background: Irish, Kiwi, from a Labor voting family. His father famously was alleged to say he'd never vote for John. A Catholic, staunch and devout, Your Grace. And indeed a touch of Bulldogs rugby league on the side. You'd have to say a trifle unusual background for a Liberal leader. Perhaps that is precisely why we're celebrating a life of such clear values, such compassion, and such a broad appeal across all segments of society. After a career in law with his own firm and Marsden's, he was the slightly unheralded winner of pre-selection for Camden in 1984, the first of many occasions where, in his own unassuming way, he exceeded everyone's expectations. He respected others, and in turn they respected his honesty, his hard work, and his willingness to engage. He dealt with princes of the church, princes of the realm, just as he did with his colleagues, Liberal and Labor, and people from all walks of life. This, of course, made him an ideal advocate for contested reforms, notably in my government as the guiding light for what were then very far-reaching workplace reforms, with an emphasis on voluntary unionism and flexible arrangements for small business. John knew the roughly 1,000 pages of legislation and regulatory reform virtually line by line, a capacity for detail which he carried forward for the rest of his political and working career. He was the ultimate boundary spanner. To this day, I'm sure there's never been a Canterbury Bankstown rugby league player who's been depicted in the press as fending off an opponent with a hand clutching his rosary beads. In these adversarial, black and white, very politicised times, it's interesting to note that John was a strong progressive on many issues, but adhered to the more conservative views of the church on others. It's fair to say he was of the sensible centre. He united his party, and he was open and interested in the views of other stakeholders. It's been widely noted over the last couple of weeks that he worked incredibly hard, sustained by nicotine, caffeine, and alcohol, especially on late nights at Parliament House. His door was always open, and he was never too busy for a chat. Indeed, on many nights, his Premier was tucked in at home and returned the next morning to find amazing progress had occurred in Parliament House overnight. He was known for his loyalty and passion for his colleagues and for his party. Indeed, it's said on a one-on-one discussion with an Auditor General, who might stay anonymous, whose criticisms John deemed unreasonable, this actually went close to a physical altercation, which John would certainly have won, but his reputation may not. As usual with John, peace prevailed. In the rather fraught days of Tim Moore and my collision with the ICAC Commissioner, John was a pillar of support, overcoming his outrage at what he felt was the unfairness, to provide loyalty and common sense, not always found at the eye of such political storms. Partly as a result, he came from veritable clouds to become Premier in a quality field. A people's Premier, as Joe Hockey has said, humble and authentic. He dealt with the political and policy legacy of my government, not always a bed of roses, and he made his own mark, both by continuing the better part of what had gone before, but also by creating his own reforms, especially in social, disability services, women's issues, and many other areas. A long frontbench career in politics is very hard on personal and family life. Colleen, as has been noted, for over half a century was always John's rock and he hers, even when they were dealt cards, public and private, that were sometimes tragic and often difficult. Together and separately, they responded in their own way, but always with strength and an eye for the interest of others. John took over the leadership of the Sydney Olympic bid in mid-1992 and quickly built his own close relationships with the many stakeholders in the Australian and International Olympic Committees, working tirelessly on the lead up to September 1993, when he found, of course, previously unrecognised high jumping skills in Monte Carlo. He then set up SOCOG and created the establishment, the basis, for the work subsequently led by the Carr government to implement the best games ever. John, I suspect, would prefer to be remembered not for the highlights of the Olympics or Prince Charles, but simply for his service to people. He was a fine local member, and signs of his legacy can be seen today in the social, sporting, and physical infrastructure of the Southern Highlands, but more importantly, in the hearts and memories of his constituents. Peter Seaton, who succeeded John as the local state member, tells a story which I think is worth briefly recounting. Peter says that one Friday night she attended, I think it might have been St Thomas Aquinas School in Bowral, for a P&F function, and was amazed to find when she got to the kitchen behind the tuck shop that there was John making the sandwiches. Quite truly a man for others. He took the defeat of the government in 1995 very hard, typically and unfairly blaming himself, despite the coalition getting a clear majority of the two-party vote. Fortunately, John Howard, from whom we'll hear in a moment, recognised that he still had much to contribute. So, my friends, as many of us who worked with him in Macquarie Street join in celebrating the life of John Fahey and his fine contributions to public life in New South Wales, we say farewell, confident that he is with his God and having a chat.
Thank you, Mr. Greiner. I now invite the Honourable John Howard, in whose government John Fahey also served, to address us.
My friends, John Fahey achieved something that a few in Australian politics have achieved, but many have tried and failed to do, and that was to make a full success of participation in both state and federal politics. Politics, of course, is composed most of the time in the contest of ideas of those who win and those who lose. I well remember the night of the 25th of March, 1995, which was the day that Bob Carr was elected as Premier of New South Wales and John Fahey's government was voted out. I recall the gathering, and we were all still trying to pretend that maybe some late returns would alter the result, but the hardheads, and John was certainly one of those when it came to electoral realities, the hardheads knew that there was going to be a change of government. And in the nature of politics, and like the seasons, governments do come and go. And many would have thought, well, that is the end of John Fahey's political career. But as well as there being a state election on that day of the 25th of March 1995, there was a by-election for the federal parliament in the seat of Canberra, which delivered an astonishing 16% swing away from the Labor Party. Now, those, of course, who know Canberra politically will warm to that wonderful comment by that great raconteur, Fred Daly, when he said, Canberra, it looks like Kalara, but votes like Cessnock. And of course, at this particular by-election, it had delivered a result. And what that meant, although it wasn't known and thought about at the time, that on the very day that he ceased to be Premier of New South Wales, there was opened up to John Fahey a second stage of his great political life. He was elected as the federal member for Macarthur at the 1996 election. And I had no hesitation in appointing him to the senior portfolio of Minister for Finance, because we'd been in opposition for a long time and there wasn't a lot of ministerial experience. And how could you pass over somebody who'd been the Premier of the largest state in the Commonwealth for a senior portfolio? And John relished the task, and he applied himself with enormous diligence. He got on top of the detailed spending proposals of departments. We set ourselves the goal of eliminating a fairly large deficit, and he worked in wonderful partnership with Peter Costello as the Treasurer. And he would fix his steady gaze on any minister that had big spending pretensions at meetings of the ERC, the Expenditure Review Committee. And he brought to that task a capacity for cover defence of the finances of the Commonwealth, reminiscent of the wonderful aggression of his great friend and cover defender for South Sydney eastern suburbs in Australia, Ron Coote, who's with us today. And he applied himself with enormous vigour and tenacity. John was a very warm person. He was a very steadfast person. His faith was there all the time, but he didn't seek to ram it down anybody's throat. He lived it. He lived the life of a staunch, devout Christian, and he impressed so many people with the way in which he held to his faith. We agreed on most things. I warmed to his commitment to industrial relations reform. We did part company on the question of Australia becoming a republic, but it was conducted in a civilised fashion, and it caused absolutely no rift or difficulty between us. John was in every way a wonderful team player. He was warm to his colleagues. If Parliament happened to be sitting on the night of a State of Origin match, He would open the doors to all comers. Most of those who turned up had a blue pass, but he was, of course, somebody who loved sport. He loved sport in all its iterations. His great passion, of course, was rugby league, but he was sympathetic to all other sports, and I can well remember, even in the midst of a lot of cost-cutting, he was able to find $500,000 extra to assist Australia's Commonwealth Games bid because he understood how important that was to the sporting reputation of our nation in the Commonwealth. John displayed, of course, enormous courage, and it's the character of the man that I remember most. I remember the character of a man who picked himself up from the disappointment of a state election defeat to embrace a new opportunity in federal politics. I remember the character of a man who brought to the federal parliament great decency, high intelligence, diligence, and a commitment to the common cause of the government, but somebody who was respected across the party political divide. Those of us who spent a lot of time in politics know the character of people, whether they're Labor or Liberal, shines through more importantly than anything. And John demonstrated that character. And those of us who admired and loved him had that love and admiration reinforced by the extraordinary courage that he and Colleen displayed in the face of great personal tragedy. And it just consolidated the regard we had, the affection we felt towards a quite remarkable man. He left a great impression on Australian public life. He is loved and remembered by people all around the Commonwealth, but particularly here in New South Wales. And this fitting tribute to his service to his church, to his family, to his state, and to his nation is an opportunity for us to not only thank him, but to thank God for him.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. I now invite Senator the Honourable Marise Payne to offer some words of eulogy.
It's a real privilege to be invited to speak to honour John Fahey today. It's a very sad day, but it's a very important one to honour and to celebrate him and his distinguished contribution to our state and to our nation. Thank you, Colleen, for this privilege. Friends, since the day I walked into John Fahey's office in 1988, John and Colleen, their then young children, Matthew, Melanie and Tiffany, and now their grandchildren, Amber and Campbell, have been a most special part of my life. And since that day in 1988, I've been the grateful beneficiary of John's love and support, his leadership, his mentorship. It was an honour to serve with him in the Federal Parliament. As Premier and Minister, State and Federal, John had many staff over the years. We were all on JF's team, and he always said we worked with him, not for him. Being a member of JF's team meant that you developed a strong passive smoking habit and a big dry cleaning bill to go with it. Either an affection for or a lifelong aversion to the scent of black drip filter coffee, but most importantly, the incredible experience of such an amazing job with him in his important roles. His roles in reforming, in leading, in prosecuting the values that brought him to the Liberal Party. We're scattered to the four winds now, but I'm confident that each of us would say it was a privilege to work with John Fahey. For some of us who've since followed the political or legal paths that brought us close to John, he was an extraordinary mentor, always available, always supportive, always had advice, and sometimes we even took it. Mostly, actually. That advice manifested itself in so many ways, not always anticipated, of course. Like the time over 12 years ago now that I invited John to dinner, a home-cooked meal for him in Sydney on a night away from his own home, and he met my partner, Stuart Ayres, for the first time. We had a great night, as always. And then, a few days later, in the mail, the envelope addressed in his distinctive handwriting came a letter, which I still have. John also handwrote the letter. It was to let me know that my decision was sound. Stuart was a good Irish Catholic man. He wore a claddagh ring, he loved sport, he was a Liberal, and he could stay. I took that advice, and I promise Melanie and I did not confer, conspire, or consult on that story. We all loved John for his passions, his principles, his values, his love for his family, and it's fair to say, for his competitive nature in sport, including the office and parliamentary tipping competitions, the odd horse race, and of course, in politics. I soon learned, working with John as Premier, that his competitive spirit topped all. In an early diplomatic foray of my own, I tried to work on his diplomatic skills on a New South Wales official visit to China in 1994. We were in Guangzhou, and the governor of Guangdong province had invited him to play tennis. John loved his tennis. I ventured to suggest that given we were being hosted by the governor, perhaps John might consider taking the game very close, but maybe allow the governor the local victory. The familiar response, "Don't be bloody ridiculous, Marise," came straight back. And he didn't. It was hot, it was humid, he played every shot to win, and win he did, for himself and his country. For over 15 years now, three of us from various iterations of Team JF, me, Ross Drinnan, John Brogden, and our spouses, have been meeting each year to have dinner with him and often Colleen. They were also fabulous nights where he caught up on the family stories, a bit of gossip, and talked politics. Some of those nights, we did a lot of listening. We all know John could chat. He never lost touch. We are immensely grateful. His support, his willingness to be a sounding board. His abiding love and friendship that marked his mentorship is irreplaceable. He will be missed.